Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a special edition of Guyana's Oil and News. I am your hostess this evening, senior journalist at Kaieteur Radio here in Wilburg. And this evening we have with us a distinguished guest, Mr. Randall Mohammed. For those of you who are not familiar with him, Randall is an energy professional with 10 years experience in the oil sector. He's managed projects in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Equatorial Guinea, Tanzania, Angola, and the list can go on and on. He's a member of the Dubai Petroleum Club, and he's also a regular commentator on the Gulf Intelligence Energy podcast. Mr. Mohammed, welcome to tonight's program.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Great. So tonight we have a very interesting topic. Guyana is often known or referred to as the Dubai of this hemisphere, the Dubai of South America. But is it really doing what's necessary to live up to such a title? So with that said, we'll get into the program. Mr. Mohammed, could you share with us what's one of the first things you'd say we need to have in place to ensure that we live up to this title? Would one of the first things be to have a vision about where we want to go?
Yes, certainly. First of all, thank you for having me on your program. And thank you to your listeners. Yes, it's a good question. And, first things first, Dubai was not built overnight. It was a long period. It was a period of 5 decades of planning and working to get to where Dubai is. So I think that's the first thing to recognize, that Rome was not built in a day. It's a long process. You have to be consistent in your approach, and you definitely have to have a plan, which should extend for the next 30 to 40 years out. Yeah. Certainly having a vision is key to it. No successful business or no successful person got to where they are today without having a vision. And that vision is usually long-term, and the vision should speak to where you want to be. And then following from that is where you have your mission, which tells us how we're going to get there.
Okay, so apart from the vision that would help to give the nation a sense of direction so that it can be successful with its oil resources, what are the key elements in your view would we need to have in place to ensure that these resources are really used for transformative purposes?
Right, good question. And that's it's a difficult one, really. So what we've seen in Dubai and the UAE is that,
When you say UAE, sorry to interrupt. When you say UAE, just for listeners, if you can expound.
United Arab Emirates,
yes.
Of which Dubai is one of the emirates. Now the UAE comprises 7 emirates, and each emirate has its independent ruler. Yes, there is a federal government. But each emirate or state, if you would like, has its own ruler. So look, Dubai got into the petroleum business in the early 70s. Back then, it was Sheikh Rashid, who was the ruler of Dubai. And, these were simple men. It's not to say that they graduated from Harvard or Yale or anything like that. They were simple men. They came from the Bedouin tribe, which was the predominant tribes in the UAE during that period. And look, they saw one fundamental thing, which was oil and gas is a non-renewable resource. In other words, one day it's going to run out. And so started the planning for Dubai's non-oil economy. So
that was started from the beginning.
Correct. They started from the beginning. So what is essential is actually putting aside a percentage of your revenues from your hydrocarbons into a sort of a sovereign fund. And that sovereign fund ideally should be used to develop what we call productive assets. Now, productive assets are assets that can generate further revenue for generations to come. Yeah. So these productive assets should have a lifespan of 30, 35, 40 years. So we're talking about roads, electricity, water, healthcare, and education. One of the fundamental building blocks for Dubai was education, and what they actually learned a lot of it from Singapore, which had a sort of a 16-year head start. And there's a very good book called From Third World to First World, which is based on the Singapore experience. And one of the key building blocks for Singapore was education. And what we saw was Lee Kuan Yew, who was the then prime minister. He actually invested a lot in his fellow ministers. So the thinking was, let's invest in my ministers, let them go away, come back and impart the knowledge, right? I'm not saying that it's a cookie cutter process, but I'm just saying that there are learnings that we can take from these different countries. Obviously the political system in Singapore and Dubai is significantly different than Guyana. In other words, what we achieve in places like Dubai and Singapore, it's because you have a sort of a single ruler, or you have a ruler that is there for a lifetime, so to speak, yeah? But certainly we can take some of these learnings.
Okay. Now, I mean, your experience is not just in Dubai. I mean, it's spread across so many different territories. And that's where I'd like to take your attention now to optimizing hydrocarbon revenues. One of the key places to start with where this is concerned, I would say, is getting a good deal. What has been the experience of not just Dubai, but other nations that you've studied in terms of getting a good deal, and what's the framework that's in place to ensure they get the most value for the resources?
Right. Look, that's an excellent question. And again, if I look at Dubai and Abu Dhabi, it's all based on partnership. What they recognize is that we cannot do this thing on our own. Firstly, because we don't have the expertise. And therefore, we need to rely on those who have the expertise. So you gotta sort of engineer an environment that encourages partnership. It has to be a two-way street, right? It's not me against them, but it has to be sort of like a good marriage, yeah? Yes, there's going to be ups and downs and there's going to be disagreements, but the idea is that there must be dialogue in there. And if you go back to Saudi Arabia, for instance, even before Saudi Arabia's oil sector was nationalized, you had the likes of BP, a lot of the American oil companies in Saudi Arabia. But what Saudi Arabia did was they didn't simply just nationalize and kick out the foreigners. There was a period of learning, and I think this is important. There must be a period of knowledge transfer. So, a lot of these economies in the Middle East, they have quite a bit of expatriates. So, the UAE's residency is comprised of 80% expats. And what they have done is they have selected the brightest and the best from around the world. And you have to look at it as an investment. It's not that you want to take away jobs from the locals, but the idea is that you want to transfer this knowledge. to the local content, to develop local content. So I would say that is very, very critical in getting a good deal, is having good partners. Again, Dubai, they have encouraged FID, foreign direct investment, and that is extremely critical to bring the money in. And this is where you have to develop a sort of a culture that encourages that FID. And if you look at countries like Singapore, for instance, they invested heavily in security because nobody wants to invest in an unsecure country. Yeah. So sound banking system, a solid financial sector, and people must feel comfortable and safe when they come to your country. Now, in terms of getting a good deal, of course, you'll have to look into the fiscal regime of some of these agreements. The most common agreement these days is the production sharing agreement. You also have concession, and you also have what we call technical agreements. But the most common is the PSA. And fundamental to the PSA is the revenue sharing portion of it. You've got royalties, you've got taxes, you've got profit share, what we call profit oil, and you've got cost oil. Just to give you a very quick comparative, one of the projects that I did was to lead the divestment of shares in an offshore block in Equatorial Guinea, known as Block P. The government and by extension, GE Petrol, which is the NOC, the National Oil Company, wanted to divest some of their shares in this block to raise money for other projects. And when I looked at the agreement, the royalty was 11% in that agreement. Profit share was 50%, and cost oil was 75%. So very similar to Guyana's PSA, except the difference would be in that royalty.
Yes.
I think you've got a 2% royalty versus an 11% royalty. And Equatorial Guinea, what they had to do is they had to bring down, that royalty figure to make it more attractive to international investors. So, this is what I spoke about, a two-way street. The thing is, we can debate all day long what is a good deal, but it's a good deal for who? At the end of the day, look, you've got 8 billion barrels of proven reserves, right, in Guyana. The way I see it, you need companies like Exxon and Hess and these guys to bring their expertise, to bring their capital to develop these resources, and at the same time, Guyana needs the revenue. And with that revenue, Guyana can then build out a more sustainable non-oil and gas economy. Yeah. But, as I said, PSAs, these fiscal regimes differ from territory to territory. And I think at the end of the day, we simply have to get on with it. It has to be sooner than later because the world is changing very, very quickly. Decades ago, we spoke about peak oil. We spoke about a shortage of supply of oil. Today, we now talk about peak oil or peak demand for oil. And, BP, Shell, and now Total, they are now projecting the demand for oil is going to start declining from 2030, right? In fact, BP has said the decline has already started. So that you can expect companies like Exxon, for instance, to try and ramp up as quickly as possible the development of those resources.
Okay, so on that note, I just want to follow up on a comment that you made there about the country needing the revenue while also needing the expertise and the technology that the company would bring, Exxonmobil. In that same vein, would you also advocate for Guyana to acknowledge that while it still needs these companies that have the experience in deep water drilling, that it should still not sacrifice at the end of the day getting the most value for its resources? Or do
Look,
you think that there can be
yes,
a compromise there?
absolutely, absolutely, there can be a compromise, and it goes back to how the contracts are written. You know, there's a clause in these contracts called a stabilization clause, which fundamentally is designed to protect the investor. I think in the case of Guyana's PSA, you have something called an economic equilibrium clause, which means there is it's not frozen per se. In other words, there can be some renegotiation of the fiscal regime given that clause. But I agree, the natural resources belong to the country, the natural resources belong to the people, and by right, you should be looking to optimize your return on those resources. However, you have to bear in mind that Guyana is sort of like the new kid on the block. You are new to hydrocarbons. You know, what was considered to be once frontier is now unrisked reserves, right? And, you know, at the end of the day, somebody has to bring this oil and gas to the surface. And only when you bring it to the surface is when it can be monetized or commercialized, yeah? So I think a few things have to happen. Guyana also has to have access to data.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in today's world, we see data as being more valuable than oil. We're in this age of digitization. You know, it's the industrial revolution 4.0, so to speak. So having access to data is critical for Guyana because it gives Guyana leverage. It will enable them to understand how much resources they have and how these resources could be exploited over time. But not knowing what you have puts you in a very difficult position. So I think it's critical that Guyana gets a hold of the data. And, you know, from my experience, you can use data warehouses in Houston, for instance, and this is what GE Petrol has done. You know, they have rented out servers and data storage capacity from BHP, for example. And of course, there's a very strict protocol on how you access that data. So that's one. And then the other aspect is accounting, proper accounting for what is being extracted. You know, we did a survey a couple of years ago, and what we found is that all of the 35 plus NOCs, not 35, sorry, it was about 58 national.
Who had done the study? Sorry, who had done the study?
It was commissioned by myself,
Mm-hmm.
but I used a contractor out of Dubai.
Okay.
To conduct the study. Yeah.
On national oil companies?
Yes, on national oil companies. Now, how I came about that, the backstory is that during one of my visits to GE Petrol in Equatorial Guinea,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, I really went to Equatorial Guinea to discuss a joint venture for oil spill response.
Okay.
And during our discussion, you know, the CEO mentioned that, you know, truthfully, we don't really have a good idea of how much revenue we're earning. So I asked the question, well, you know, what do you do? He says, well, you know, monthly, the oil companies invoice us and we just accept it. So they had no real way of reconciling what was pumped versus what was sold, right?
Oh, okay.
And so hence I got the idea to develop a hydrocarbon accounting system, but it will be more automated. It's not a bunch of Excel spreadsheets. This will be an automated process where we pull data directly from the metering systems and we process it in a database to produce management reports. But the key really was to reconcile what was pumped at the production site versus what is transferred to the sales pipeline. And then in your case, it's on an FPSO. And then from FPSO, you transfer to a tanker that then goes off and sells the oil in the international market.
So the study that you did, it's on how many? Over 30 national oil companies across the world?
58 national oil companies across Asia, Middle East, and Latin America.
And of the 58, how many did not have a proper accounting system? Or how many?
Right, if I remember correctly, it was about 35.
Wow. Okay.
Of those companies did not have, in words, they did not have a comprehensive system enough where they could 100% say that, yes, this is how much revenue we have earned this month. In some cases, the information was very scattered and you had to dig very, very deeply to get it. But in a lot of cases, it would be inaccurate because there was a lot of manual data. Yeah. Okay. So I think now is the time. I know you're moving on to Payara. You've just approved the development program.
Yes.
For that. That's another 220,000 barrels of oil. And I think really now is the time to lay down the foundation, to get your house in order, so to speak. I know sometimes we run very, very fast and we tend to leave a couple doors open. And we've all been through that. When I was in telecoms, we were running so fast because of the competition, we left many doors open. But there comes a point in time where we need to close some of those doors. Yeah. So, while you attempt to renegotiate the contract, now is a good time to put these things in place, begin to digitize your processes, begin to collect the data and warehouse that data.
Okay, that's a very important point there, actually. So I want to take your attention now to the importance of saving a portion of the oil money for future generations. What, in your view, is necessary for us to achieve the right balance of spending the right portion of that money to sort of fill the infrastructural gap and still save enough for our future generations? How do we go about saving the right amount as well as spending while avoiding corruption?
Right, that's a good one, and I think it really starts from the government's plans. In other words, what are your plans to develop the country, let's say over the next 20, 30 years, right? And those plans usually come with a budget. And the budget will say, okay, we got to spend X amount of $1 billion to develop these projects over the next 20, 30 years, right? And so you got to start from that point and then work backwards to determine, well, how much do I need to save today in order to have these income streams to fund my fiscal budget or my national budget for the next 20 years. So there's no real hard and fast rule. Every country will be different based on your ability to develop your country. But certainly, having a sovereign wealth fund is critical. And, today, countries like Norway, for instance, sit on trillions of dollars in oil revenue. Abu Dhabi, for instance, I believe their wealth fund is worth just over $1 trillion, right? And what they have done is they have then created sub companies, which then begin to invest that money, right? So, for example, in Abu Dhabi, one of those companies is investing in next generation technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analysis, data collection, etc. And then another company is also investing in renewable energy, right? And then another company will invest in what we call productive assets. So, for example, Dubai now has, I would say, world-class infrastructure, roads, buildings, hospitals, schools, etc. Yeah, and those assets should be built in such a manner it will give you at least 30, 35 years worth of returns, right?
But I believe they were able to achieve that sort of infrastructural growth because there were the right institutions in place. There were robust institutions and systems in place to ensure that that money that is set aside for that purpose is actually going where it's intended to. So I suppose the lesson for Guyana, from what I'm hearing what you're saying there, is that we definitely need to look at the nations that really got it right and pull from that, especially the importance of having the institutions to really spend this money effectively.
Correct. Look, undoubtedly, and that really comes back to the sort of the will and the strength of your leaders, right? Because it's no secret that some of these countries suffer from what we call the resource curse, or the so-called Dutch disease, where corruption has been endemic. I could think of countries like Angola, for instance,
Yes.
where $32 billion went missing from the coffers, right? But definitely that is something that the government has to put into place, to try and minimize the corruption, because the corruption can really bleed a lot of revenue from the country. Now, if we turn our attention to Trinidad and Tobago, a couple of years ago—
Which is where you're from.
Correct.
Originally.
Correct. That's where I'm from originally. We had set up this stabilization and heritage fund, where a portion of the oil revenues are deposited. Yeah. But I think the real structure should be that even before the money goes to the government budget, it should go to your savings fund first. In other words, let your oil revenues go to your savings fund, and then from the savings fund, it is allocated to the government. So what you do is you ensure you save first and spend later, right? And if I am not mistaken, I believe Guyana had developed a green, I think it was a so-called green paper on the mechanism of saving a portion of your oil revenues.
Yes, we did move forward with putting together a Natural Resource Fund Act, but I believe that is being repealed, and the PPP administration will be putting its own robust framework in place for that.
Right. So if I could just advise,
Yes.
Because I don't like to dictate to governments what they should do and shouldn't do. You're a sovereign nation, right? So I can advise that have a close look at that mechanism whereby those oil revenues go into a savings account, And then from the savings account, it is allocated to the government for, maybe recurrent expenditure and expenditure on projects, right? At least it will ensure that a portion of those funds, a portion of the revenue is saved, and it acts as sort of a control mechanism, right? Where the savings fund will have its own governing body, and through that governing body, they will then say how the money should be dispersed.
Okay. Thank you for that recommendation. And we'll wrap up this evening's program with your concluding thoughts on the oil industry in light of the pandemic, the transition to cleaner energy, and where the future of the new Dubai of the region stands in the face of those matters.
Right. So, look, as you know, the oil sector is in a very difficult situation. COVID-19 has caused unprecedented demand destruction, right? It's the first time in history we've actually seen prices hit negative territory. If you remember back in April, WTI posted negative $40.
That's West Texas Intermediate, which is a grade of oil?
Correct. The West Texas Intermediate, which is one of the key indices for pricing for U.S. Crude oil, right?
Thank you.
At the same time, Brent, which is the international benchmark for crude oil, hit prices in the teens. It didn't go to negative because the fundamental difference between Brent and WTI is that Brent is waterborne, whereas WTI is landlocked. So in the case of West Texas Intermediate, we have challenges with storage.
Okay.
When you get a situation where there's not enough demand and excessive supply, the oil has to go somewhere. And the reason it hit negative figures is because producers had to pay traders to take the oil, right? And that presented a very tragic scenario. So where we are today is, look, oil prices seem to be stuck in the low 40s, right? And as a result, we have seen a lot of the oil companies lay off employees.
Yes.
We've seen the oil companies chop their capital expenditure as well. So they've taken billions of dollars off their balance sheets, right? And, as much as OPEC is trying, and, we have to give some kudos to OPEC.
Which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries? Precisely,
which comprises 13 countries, right? But they had formed an alliance with Russia, right? So it's now called the OPEC Plus agreement. And with that, countries like Mexico, for instance, have joined that alliance. So one wonders whether sometime in the future, whether Guyana would consider joining OPEC, because based on your projected production of 750,000 barrels per day, you will actually outrank at least 3 to 4 members of OPEC, right?
And there are also projections of Guyana going as high as 900,000 barrels before 2030, I believe.
Right. So there you go. It's quite significant,
Yes.
So as I had mentioned before, maybe a decade or two ago, the narrative was peak oil supply, where it was felt that there simply was not enough oil on the market to satisfy demand. Then came something called shale, what we call a shale oil revolution, and that threw that theory out the window. So that has now put the U.S., has made the U.S. the #1 producer in the world. They peaked at around 13.5 million barrels per day, but because of the pandemic, that has been cut back to around 10.4 million barrels per day. Now today, the narrative is peak oil demand, where we see the consumers actually turning away from hydrocarbons, right? And going towards renewables, biofuels, and hydrogen, as well as electric vehicles. And, you know, Total has now joined BP and Shell in that discussion, right?
Yes.
And these companies are investing more and more in renewables. In fact, Shell, both BP and Shell has said that they're going to cut oil production by, I think, 40% in the coming decade, and sort of shift their investment into renewables and alternative fuels. Yeah. So, if we could conclude, I make the point, it's better later than never. So, Guyana finds itself at this cross point where you've got the hydrocarbons, you've got the oil, and within the next decade, we're going to be seeing peak oil demand. And therefore, I think it's imperative that Guyana carries on with the development of those resources and really tries to optimize the revenues from those resources. And it is critical that they partner with the international contractors and the international oil companies, because it's a two-way street.
Okay. Mr. Mohammed, thank you so much for being part of our discussion tonight, which looked at the new Dubai of the region, that is Guyana, and the future that it faces. And you've provided some really insightful recommendations and some of your experience in different parts of the world that you've served. So once again, thank you so much for being part of the discussion this evening. And to our viewers on Facebook Live, those listening to us wherever you are via your radio, thank you very much for joining us. And we do hope you can be back with us same time, same place for more insightful discussions on Guyana's future as an oil producer. Thank you and good evening. Good night, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you. Take care. Pleasure.
You too.